I would like to introduce Marco. Hello, Marco.
Hello, Trisha. Hi.
I love how basically everyone, all the speakers are like sat on the edge of the stream going, I've got to look ready in case she adds me to the stream. And I don't know, we're drinking coffee. Going, yes.
Yes. Yeah, pretty much.
So yes, it's really great to have you on here, Marco. Not just because it means I don't have to do the Spring tips and tricks. So I think I got to sort of know you vaguely a couple of years ago. I just looked it up actually. I think it's like 3-4 years ago because you were submitting a bunch of stuff to show in Java Annotated Monthly. You were doing some great videos which use IntelliJ IDEA, which is great. Use IntelliJ IDEA properly, which is even better. And you had some really good content, especially around things like Spring and stuff like that. So it's really good to have you now on board as part of the team of the developer advocates.
Yeah, I'm super excited to be here.
I'm so pleased to have you. This is excellent. Yes. Oh, and I forgot to mention that you are the developer advocate for Team City, right?
Yep. Team City. Yeah. So all about build, CI processes and whatnot. Great.
I don't know what I was going to say. It's the end of the day. Oh, yes. So apparently you like to explore cities by foot. How is that working out for you right now?
Well, at least my hometown is. I mean, the thing is, I know my way around my hometown, so it's working out okay-ish. I mean, I've been to many places 20 million times, basically. But yes, I do that, and I think I also mentioned that I like to show people around, and I was hoping that not too many people take me up on that offer at the same time once the lockdown is gone, or else I'm going to run into troubles. But yes, yeah, exploring cities is something which I like to do very much.
And I think it's cool that you already live in Munich. So you're one of the few people who doesn't have to move to actually be near one of our offices, particularly amongst the developer advocates, because we're mostly remote.
Yeah, that's true. And it's a great Russian experience because a lot of my colleagues in Munich are Russians. So it's quite international, I'd say.
Very cool. Right. I will let you get on with it. I'm looking forward to seeing your Spring tips and tricks. Have fun.
Thank you. Thanks. So yes, hi all. For what it's worth, this talk is called IntelliJ and Spring Tips and Tricks from the Trenches, because I'm essentially going to show you features that I myself like to use in my day-to-day Spring projects or Spring Boot projects. And as I'm not too much of a fan of slides, this is going to be the only slide you're seeing. We're going to do some live coding, essentially building a small Spring Boot application from the ground up. And I'm going to talk about the features along the way. And don't worry, I don't want you to stress out and try and remember all the features I'm showing, because it's quite a lot of stuff I'm going to go through. I'm quite happy actually on the last session because it's the first time I'm doing this talk, and I'd like to see how far I can go in 1 hour. But if you just remember 1 or 2 features, 1 or 2 tricks, back to the video recording that we put up on YouTube, with the timestamps of the different tips, tricks, and features sorted by category, then I'm basically already happy, and you're on your way to become much more productive with IntelliJ and your Spring projects. That is, as I mentioned, everything I wanted to show you. Let me close that slide, go straight to the IDE, because we're going to start at the very beginning. The very beginning is opening up a new project, in this case, a Spring Boot project. And what I'm showing you, just mentioning it again, is valid for IntelliJ Ultimate Edition, because the Community Edition doesn't have the Spring integration features. Now, Yuri already mentioned parts of it in his talk, but when you create a new project, you can essentially, for a Spring Boot project, go and choose the Spring Initializer option straight out of the new project dialog. You have a couple of options. Most of you who created Spring Boot projects will know start.spring.io. I'm just going to open up that page here. It's the Spring Initializer homepage where you can create a vanilla project skeleton, Maven or Gradle, choose between different programming languages, add your Spring Boot dependencies. And then you can create a project, generate a project, download a zip file, unzip it on your hard disk, open it up, or you can just stay inside your IDE, because Spring Initializer also offers a REST API, which IntelliJ integrates against, and do the same thing you did on the website straight out of IntelliJ, which we're going to do in a second when I press the next button. But I wanted to talk about that custom field, because some people were confused in the past what the custom field is. And essentially what's happening when you work, say, in the bigger corporation, you have multiple modules that you want to include in new projects. You can actually fork the Spring Initializer project and create your own company initializer and put the URL to that company initializer into your custom field, just to let you know what that is for. Now we're going to hit next. I'm just going to call this project IntelliJ Birthday 20 Spring. We're going to talk a bit about Maven and Gradle in a second. All the other options, Java, Jar, doesn't really matter. I'm not going to talk about that for now. What I want to talk a bit about is the dependencies we're going to add to the project, because that is roughly the scope of my talk. So I'm going to show you a couple of things when you build RESTful applications. So I'm going to add the Spring Web dependency. I'm also going to talk about templating libraries, so Thymeleaf in this case, but also Free Marker Velocity. I hope I get the time to talk about Spring Data Jdbc, or rather all the Spring Data projects, hopefully. I can't promise it yet. Then we have the Actuator, which gives you live data about your Spring Boot project, health endpoints and whatnot, and also, DevTools. I think that's a good start. And if I'm missing something, I'm just going to add it in a second to the project. Now, while the project opens up, let me talk about one boring but very important point. When you have a Spring Boot project and when you have a Spring MVC project, and you open it up in IntelliJ, IntelliJ is smart enough to automatically configure the Spring support. And you can see that when you go to File, Project Structure, you go to Facets, and there's a facet, which is a Spring facet. And the Spring facet detected my application class, which we're going to talk about in a second, and the properties file. This is what you need for the Spring support to work. So if you work with Spring Boot, you don't have to do anything. If you are working with a plain Spring framework project, the facet gets automatically detected, but all these configurations are missing. You have to configure the facet yourself. If you don't configure the facet yourself, you don't have any of those nice features I'm going to show you. Very important, just to keep in mind to get that right. Now, we have a very simple Spring Boot project, normal project directory structure. I want to talk just a tiny second about the POM XML file and a bit about IntelliJ's Maven support. It's not entirely related to, it's not entirely Spring Boot specific or Spring specific, but something I still use quite a lot. Now, I forgot actually to add a dependency. Let me try that again. I want to add a database dependency. In my case, H2. Now, what I could do is I could go to the H2 database homepage, find the dependency block, copy and paste it back into my POM XML file, or I can only simply hit Alt-Insert on Windows, and you can see the shortcut I'm using at the bottom of the screen, and I can simply insert the dependency straight out of IntelliJ. I can search for H2. I kind of have to know what I'm looking for because I need the group ID, the artifact ID. In my case, I know I've been using the H2 database a lot. com.h2 database is my dependency, the one I want. I can choose between different dependency versions, and I can simply add it to the project by hitting Enter. What I want to show you is there's a nice little, the 1.4200 version is highlighted, and it says it comes from Spring Boot's dependency management, right? Because Spring Boot comes with a ton of dependencies and properties predefined, and that's why you don't have to specify the version number here. And when you insert the dependency, IntelliJ is smart enough to just leave out the version number. Always make sure, tiny bit here at the top right button, click Load Maven Changes. People tend to forget that, yeah? So that the POM XML file gets reloaded, dependencies downloaded and whatnot. Which brings us to these gutter icons. And I'm going to be talking a lot about gutter icons in this talk. You have a gutter icon here. Please do not never ignore these gutter icons. If there's one thing you take away from this talk, just don't ignore gutter icons. Hover over them the first time you see a gutter icon to see what it could roughly be. In this case, you'll find that it gives you the full dependency block from the parent POM in this case. And you can also navigate through the gutter icon to where the dependency is declared in the parent project. Here you can see the version number is placeholder. IntelliJ was smart enough to replace that placeholder on the fly. Right? And you can see the different versions here being set in that Spring Boot specific properties file. It's really about navigation, and don't be scared if you don't know where a dependency comes from. You have the gutter icon. You can always find the parent pom. You can find the dependency versions and whatnot. Super simple but convenient features. Now, the same thing also works with Gradle files. If you do the alt insert in Gradle files, what's going to happen is that IntelliJ will tell you, do you want to insert a Maven dependency into my Gradle file and convert the XML syntax automatically into Gradle syntax? So that works both ways, essentially. There's many more features regarding Maven support, but I just wanted to touch that briefly. So I wanted to get into Spring Boot now, finally. Imagine we want to build yet another CRUD application, so a REST service. You have some Angular application, you have a React application that wants to display some users from a database later on. So you're going to have an endpoint, users endpoint, which simply sends some users to the front end. And on the lower level, I guess at some point, you're going to have a class which is called user service. And that class is probably going to have a method, get users. And I'm just going to create, quickly going to create a user class. That's the most amount of coding I'm going to do here. With a name. I'm just going to let IntelliJ create a constructor, create a getter, and whatnot. It's a very simple user class with just a string name field. Now, my user service returns a list of these users. And what you're going to do is return list of, at the moment, I'm just going to return new user myself. I'm going to be a bit selfish for now. But this is a normal Java class. You can turn it into a Spring Bean, for example, by adding the component annotation. Because the Spring application will search for, by default, to do a component scan and search for all the classes in this package and sub-packages, and we'll find out, well, here's a class with a component annotation, for example, an instantiator bean. Now, what you might have already noticed, if I comment this out or I comment it in again, there's one thing that changes. And the one thing that changes is the gutter icon. And you already saw the gutter icon a second ago in the Maven, in the POM XML file. The gutter icon here is a Spring Bean. It's just a green bean, has a Java class in the lower right corner. If that was a Spring Bean defined in an XML file, you wouldn't have that blue C here, right? And now what does that gutter icon let me do? It lets me navigate to the application which instantiates my bean. So that's a one-way street from bean to application context. Very important. In a simple project like this, you might be thinking, oh, Marco, it's even in the same package, in the same Java package. But in bigger projects, if you have hundreds of beans, it's really cool to be able to go from the bean to the application context. It also works the other way around. If you have a look at that gutter icon up here with the magnifying glass, here you'll see all the beans that your application component scans. So you can also go the other way. You can go back to the user service from your application class. Also very cool. So the navigation works both ways. And that brings us to one of the, let's say, general concepts. That's the only thing I wanted to take you away from this talk is gutter icons, very important. And navigation is one of those big topics you can do through gutter icons, right? Let's make the example a bit more complex. Imagine you have, for whatever reason, another password service, right? And you don't create that password service with a component annotation. You just go to your Spring application and write a bean method, which is also a valid way of creating new beans. And you can already see a new gutter icon popping up here. I'll show you that gutter icon in a second, but let's first go into the password service. Again, you can see IntelliJ was smart enough by the way, without booting up the application. It's all being done at, well, compile time, basically. You can see these highlightings work. You can go back to the application context. There's also a gutter icon here, which says navigate to auto-wired candidates, which I cannot do at the moment. What this gutter icon lets me do is I can go to every class which has a password service, where the password service is injected, basically. Let's try and do that. Let's go to the user service, and let's do something that Yuri already talked about. A very bad thing. Let's put an auto-wired inside here, and we're just going to auto-wire it, not the user service. We're going to auto-wire the password service, right? You got the icon. Navigate. You navigate strictly to the password service definition. And here with that button, you can also navigate back again. So there's always a two-way navigation in these with these gutter icons, right? And if I have more dependencies, I will get a list. If I had my password service injected in more other beans, I will get a list here, and I could choose directly which bean I want to jump into. When you have a look, the other gutter icons you can see here in the Spring application, for example, run is pretty much self-explanatory. So you can run and debug the application, right? It's on the class level. It's also on the main method. And then when you look at the gutter icon here on the application, you can, for example, also open up Spring diagrams. Now, I have to admit something. I'm not the biggest fans of the Spring diagrams, even though sometimes they're useful, for example, to find circular dependencies and whatnot. But by default, when, for example, you open up the beans dependencies diagram, you will be hit with a pretty big diagram window. That's because Spring Boot auto-configures so many beans and so many contexts in addition to what the beans you have defined yourself. So I'm not going to cover these big diagrams for now. I'm going to show you a couple of smaller ones later on. But just so you know, you can also always generate these diagrams. Now, when we go to the user service, Yuri already took it away, which is a bit sad. But now imagine you're working in a project where you do the field annotation, the field injection, and you decide, well, I want to switch to constructor injection. Then, apart from navigation, IntelliJ offers you something else for Spring. It's always these convenience features, like alt insert in the POM XML file. And IntelliJ has alt enter. So you just go on the auto-wired field, hit alt enter, and change from field injection to constructor injection. Very simple. Not much you can do, not much you have to do. And now you can take some time in your old projects and just convert field to constructor injection. While we're talking about convenience, there's also something else, which is quick error highlighting. When, for example, you go to the to your Spring application and comment out the password service definition, that means your application now has no password service. And when it boots up, you'll get an ugly error. Actually, let me just run the application. And after a couple of seconds, it takes time to compile. It takes time to boot up, right? I will get an error message saying, Marco, you should have defined a password service bean somewhere in the application. Interestingly, you could have also gone to the user service directly, and you would have seen, hey, there's an error. Because IntelliJ is smart enough to tell you already, again, at compile time, it can tell you, hey, you have no beans of password service defined. They weren't found. You can also find these errors in the problem section here. There's a problems tool window, which I have collapsed now in presentation mode, where you can see what dependencies could not be auto-wired. So you can skip the whole, let me run my application, and then I see what the error is. At startup, you can immediately see the error right in your IDE. The issue is, so actually let me just turn that back now. So you can see the highlighting is immediately, the red underlining is gone again. The issue is, and I know it from past project myself, that people misconfigured the Spring facet, didn't configure the Spring facet. They kind of got used to having red underlinings, and then they simply ignored the red underlinings and just tried to boot up the application, even though IntelliJ already told them there is something missing. So either you had Spring misconfigured, or there was something that the Spring support and IntelliJ misconfigured, or there was something really broken. What I want you to do is make sure you have the Spring facet set up correctly, which in most cases you don't even have to do because it works automatically. And then care about these red error highlightings. Don't just ignore them, right? Every time you see a red error highlighting, try to fix it. This kind of already, when I talked about concepts at the very beginning, navigation, convenience features like alt enter and whatnot, and error highlighting. These three things, the trinity, let's call it, I want you to take away. And I'm going to repeat these concepts over and over and over again in the next couple minutes. Right. Now, when we have these, let's say, basic navigation features and whatnot, auto-completion, let's talk a bit about properties. In Spring Boot, again, something that Yuri briefly touched on, you have a ton of properties, a ton of property files even. And if you've been working with Spring Boot for a while, I mean, you could always go to the documentation, find, the Spring Boot property key, so to speak, copy and paste it back into your properties file, or you can simply use IntelliJ's auto-completion if you already roughly know what you're looking for. So for example, I can start typing, I get an auto-completion, and if I wanted to change my database URL, I would go to springdatasource.ul, right? And I can simply start typing and put in my H2 memory database URL here. If I had a typo inside, IntelliJ would tell me, it would highlight the Spring data source and tell me, hey, I could not resolve that configuration property, right? Even what I find even cooler, actually, let me comment that out. You can see already you have the full type information here. So there's a different property, Spring data source continue an error, for example, which later on gets converted to a Boolean field. IntelliJ automatically suggests me, hey, put in false or true. Again, when you put in another value, JEJ, for example, or 123, you will get error highlighting in IntelliJ. IntelliJ will let you still boot up the application, and you will simply get an error at runtime. So you could also simply take the time and have a look inside the properties file and have a look at the red underlinings and fix them before you boot up your Spring application, right? Obviously, you can also have your own custom properties, so special username. Let's add another user that we can put into our user service. And I'm just going to put Hadi here, a user who is close to my heart, right? And then I would go to my user service. And I'm just going to do some constructor injection again. I just want to put in the special username inside my user service. Again, let IntelliJ alt enter all the way, let it add the special username. I'm just going to put the special username down here as well. So we're going to have two users that our REST service in a second will return. And again, you can already see IntelliJ tells me a special username, right? Could not auto-wire, no beans of string type found. So we didn't define any beans. In fact, I don't want a string bean to be defined. I want that string to come from a properties file, which you do with the @value annotation. Again, here, convenience features, simply do a basic completion. You get to see all the keys you have to find, special username, even the value. You can see the file that the property comes from, right? Special username. So I'm just going to do autocomplete. I'm not even typing it anymore, having to worry about is that the right property key and whatnot. So just let it do the autocompletion. Again, I can navigate between the Java class and the properties file. I can navigate between the properties file and the Java class also back. Actually, that works. Now it doesn't work, but okay. And I just want to show you, let me go back to the user service, completion, navigation, error highlighting, basically. That's what it's all about. Properties. While we're at properties, there's something else. If you start working with profiles in Spring Boot, also something that people do a lot. So imagine you want to slightly override your properties file, application staging properties. The special username is now written slightly differently. So I'm just going to put in some nonsensical stuff here. Hadi is now written like so. When you go back to user service, right, and do a quick definition of the property, what IntelliJ can show you is all the properties files that the property comes from. So application of properties, application staging the properties, you can immediately see what value that property has depending on the properties file. So get used to the quick definition shortcuts, navigation shortcuts, auto-completion. It's all done in your browser, and you don't always have to go back and forth between properties files and Java classes, because by highlighting a property and pressing the right keyboard shortcut, right? I hope you can actually see that here at the bottom, the quick definition. You have it all in the same window. Bringing the concept to an end, imagine also you have, regarding profiles, you have another bean, because on your staging environment, you want to have a bean which is being executed, a component that inserts some data on your staging environment. And it should only be run in the staging profile, under the staging profile. Which you can do with the add profile annotation, add profile staging, right? This is all you need to do for now. Now the time comes to run your application, right? That's always interesting how people run their Spring Boot application. And I've been running my Spring Boot application directly. So I just hit run Spring application. I can edit my configuration though. Before that, I'm sure you've seen that window a couple of times already. And you get a couple of Spring Boot specific features. One of those features is, for example, active profiles. You can set the active profile here with auto-completion even. So IntelliJ is smart enough to scan all your components, find out, hey, he had a component defined with a profile annotation staging. So IntelliJ just lets you automatically auto-complete that profile into that little text box here, yeah, right? And then IntelliJ will take that and convert this text field into a VM option like -d Spring Profiles Active, if I'm not mistaken. The same with the parameters. You don't have to, fumble with the parameters on the command line and override them as a VM option and -d, whatever. You can just say that special username, including auto-completion, should now be something completely else, right? So again, what I want you to do is get used to auto-completion, get used to navigation, and all these helper functions, really. There's even more helper functions, including hiding the banner. If you're sick of seeing the Spring Boot banner, which you can click, make use of all the tools that Spring Boot, that IntelliJ offers you when it comes to Spring Boot. And maybe last but not least, what I wanted to tell you, there's also some folks who are still stuck with XML application context, especially in companies with legacy projects. There's the odd, because Spring is super backwards compatible, there's the odd Spring application context XML. And all these features I showed you, auto-completion, navigation, whatnot, all these, they work with IntelliJ as well. You can even create, your Spring config, like so, application context, which creates an application context XML. You would maybe include it in your application like so, import resource, right? Even here you get auto-completion. So get used to having these auto-completion features in your annotations, for example, application context XML, right? And then you can simply start adding your Spring Beans and whatnot, your password service inside here, even though I have it already defined. That also works for people stuck with XML application context. There's even more features when it comes to Spring's expression language, to the cacheable annotation, for example, to event listeners, and even more gutter icons, gutter icons, gutter icons. I cannot go into all of these features here. I'm going to show you one tiny trick regarding gutter icons. Go to settings, right? And simply search for gutter. And then you'll at least find a nice little list of all the different gutter icons that IntelliJ offers you, not just for Spring, but for Swagger, for the HTTP client, for Java, for everything. So I found a good way to get used to what does a specific gutter icon mean, what could it do, or you just hover over the gutter icon to see what it actually does, right? Right. So that was a lot of talk about, let's say, basic Spring features. Remember the Trinity, navigation, auto-completion, arrow highlighting. Let's finally start writing a REST service. And what you would probably do is you're going to end up with a user controller, right? Which is a a REST controller. I'm assuming you know your way around Spring Boot, right? And you're going to end up with a get mapping for users. All you're going to do is return the list of users, which you get. Let me see. Now the import is here, which you get by injecting the user service inside your controller class. And you're just going to go turn user service get users. Right? That's all you need to do for now. When you boot up the application, now let me just run the application, right? What you usually would do now is you run the application, it boots up, that looks fine. I didn't get an error message, an exception in my log. Then maybe you open your browser, you open up a third-party tool to some REST client, whatever, which is all fine, fair play. But you could also have a look at these new gutter icons that you just see in your controller class. Because again, IntelliJ was already smart enough to see, well, this is a controller. I'm going to show you some new gutter icons. It shows me a gutter icon to open up let me just click that. You can click it. It tells me immediately run HTTP request for this get mapping for /users call in IntelliJ's HTTP editor. So I can just click run here. And immediately, actually, my application booted up. You can see now the REST client open up. It did a get against localhost 8080 users. And I can see a nice little JSON output, name Marco, name Hardy, 2 different users, right? That works. The output works for JSON, HTML, for XML, and whatnot. Very simple, super cool feature. Instead of running the request directly, you could have also opened it up in a browser, which I told you about, or in the HTTP request editor, which brings you to the new HTTP request editor in IntelliJ. The old one looked a bit different. Now, again, this is not entirely specific to Spring Boot. It works obviously with all other technologies, but it's such a cool feature. I just want to quickly run you through it. You can see you have get users, right? Simply hit Alt Enter, run, that works. If you worked in a bigger project and you didn't exactly know what is the URL of my endpoint I'm calling, again, what you can do is, which I find pretty freaky, auto-completion. Just go behind your host and your port, do auto-completion, and IntelliJ will automatically tell you, well, there's one user's endpoint you have in your Spring application. I can auto-complete that. If I only have, by the way, one get endpoint here. If I put post here, IntelliJ wouldn't show me anything because I don't have a post endpoint, right? So again, I find a fascinating feature just like that. You can do gets against your REST endpoints. If you don't feel comfortable with the syntax of how can you actually write requests in the HTTP client, very simple, you have a couple of buttons up here, and those buttons help you a lot. So for example, when you do add request, it tells you, well, why don't you just want to post a text body here? And it inserts automatically the request for your template request for you, which obviously doesn't work now, but I'm going to show you a very cool feature again. I set the content type to application JSON, which means I can type here, hello world. IntelliJ will automatically do syntax highlighting. It will tell me this is not valid JSON. You can see it underlined in red again. If I switch the content type to application XML, then immediately IntelliJ will tell me the whole thing is not XML. Or you wanted to write is something else. So, for example, this tag, auto-completion features, very, very simple and cool way to get, to issue all your REST requests, not just against Spring Boot endpoints, but against any endpoints, basically. And what you can also do is, for example, convert, which I like to do a lot, is convert these calls between curl, from curl, to curl again. So if I just click this, you can see the actual curl call. You can copy and paste this to your command line and just run the same request. If you had a curl call from Stack Overflow, copy and paste coding, you can simply put it into the HTTP editor. It will work. You have even more examples for request with authorization, basic out, and all this kind of stuff. It's a very powerful tool and something I'd like you to take a look at, basically. HTTP client, keep that in mind. Super useful, super helpful to work with it. Now, when you go back to the user controller, there's something else I wanted to show you, which you basically can see when you click this gutter icon up here. There's even more gutter icons. And I cannot say gutter icon enough in this talk, basically. You can see, well, when you hit that one, you can open it up in an HTTP client, what we just did. You can also click Go to Declaration or Usages. Very important. IntelliJ tells you where in your project, in your HTML files, JavaScript files, in your REST editor, where does the user's endpoint get called? At the moment, it only gets called in the file I just showed you, right? So you can just go there. But if you had a big project again, it's super helpful to see where does the endpoint in your project get called. By the way, what I just clicked the user controller here. What you also can do is, so again, navigation, you just step inside. You can also step back straight from the HTTP client back into the controller class that defines the endpoint. So again, here navigation works both ways, right? And so we covered the navigation, the usages both ways. We covered the HTTP client. What we haven't covered yet is show all endpoints of a module. What does this do? Now it opens up a tool window. I'm just going to close it again because you'll find it at the bottom of the screen. You'll find the endpoints tool window. Again, it's not entirely specific to Spring. It just works with Spring. Also other frameworks, which you can find out about on the website. But essentially, what it gives you again at compile time is a complete overview of all the, for example, REST endpoints of your application. So you can see you have one module, that's your project. It's called IBJ20 Spring. It has one endpoint, a user's endpoint, listening to GET requests in a user controller class. You immediately see some documentation, which you don't have here yet. You have a tab for an HTTP client call. You can immediately issue requests against an endpoint, an open API description. So there's even more to it than that. But just to show you how that works, when you go here and create a new endpoint, admins, for example, you'll immediately, again, at compile time, see the new admins endpoint here. And you can just jump straight into the method, the declaring method, by double-clicking that. Again, a bit simple in this simple example, but super, super helpful in big projects. You can search for these endpoints, right? Just put in admin or just put in A or whatever. Placeholdering, you'll get every endpoint that starts with A. I find a very simple, useful feature. Even more, you might get the impression that endpoints only have to do with server endpoints, because that's what we wrote at the beginning. At the moment, we just had get mapping admins, get mapping users. It also works for client endpoints. So, for example, if you say you have a new REST template, for example, and do get for objects, and again, I find it gets pretty scary. So imagine in the real world, you basically call a REST endpoint, right? And again, you do an auto-completion in your get for object method, and you get auto-completion for admins and for users. IntelliJ is smart enough to do that, right? You just do that, like so. Now that call inside, if you're thinking about programming logic, that call doesn't make sense here, but I wanted to show you a tiny feature. The feature is that in the endpoints tool window, you also see the endpoints you call as a client. So you can see already here, you're calling localhost 8080/users a get call inside the endpoints window. You have some filtering possibilities up here. So for example, if you go by type and you only want to see HTTP server endpoints, you'll only see your Spring controllers. If you search for HTTP client, you'll also only see the endpoints you hit with your REST template in that case. And you can also filter by framework, WebSocket client, WebSocket server, MVC controllers, REST operations, test REST template, web test client, a ton of stuff. What I want you to take away from the endpoints window at compile time, not at runtime, you have all the information you need and you can navigate quickly between different endpoints, be it server or be client endpoints. And by the way, because so far what I've been doing is I've been using plain good old Spring MVC. That means I didn't use any Spring Web Flux, no reactive frameworks, no web client, no reactive REST client, so to speak. Everything I'm showing here basically works for both. It works for Spring MVC, for the reactive Web Flux framework, so you don't have to worry about that. But I cannot show too much in one single session. Let's quickly sum up the Jdbc support with the controllers. I want you to get into the habit when you write your controllers, have a look at the gutter icons. The gutter icons will let you find out where do you find usages, for example. Where is users being called? You can open up the HTTP client, you can fire up requests, and you have this endpoint tool window, all super useful. And a tiny trick at the end is, by the way, if you're opening up a project and you don't really know, you just have the URL of your REST endpoint, you can do a search all action inside IntelliJ and just search, for example, for /admins. And in the search all window, you can find the URL /admins. It will take you straight to the controller class, which defines the get mapping in this case. Also super useful. Okay, that was REST controllers. And I mentioned at the beginning, I'm also going to show how to work with HTML templates, because I like to work with HTML templates too. And maybe you don't have an SBA application, and you still like to work with Thymeleaf, free marker velocity, and whatnot. What does IntelliJ offer in combination with Spring and Thymeleaf in this case? Now, let me add a template. I'm just going to call it home, right? And there's one important thing, right, that didn't work. I just need to quickly do something that is copy and pasting the namespace declaration of Thymeleaf, right? Which you need to do to trigger the Thymeleaf support. We're going to end up with, we have a Thymeleaf added to the project. We going to have welcome, for example, and then just a list. So I just want to go through all the users that we basically created that our user service has. In Thymeleaf speech, you would end up with the th each block, and we have to find out in a second how this works. But you can already see again, IntelliJ tells you, "Ooh, that block doesn't look right." So error highlighting already at compile time. You don't have to wait to boot up the application to find out that this template now is not quite right. I'm going to create a new controller. I'm just going to call it web controller for now. It's a simple controller, not a REST controller. And again, you're going to have a gap mapping. This time, Spring expects a template string that you return from that method. So in here, you need to return the template. You might have noticed by now, I don't even know what my template is called. I just click autocompletion. And IntelliJ is smart enough to scan all the templates you have in your project. Again, might seem a bit anticlimactic if I just have one template and know exactly what it's called. But if you have many hundreds of templates, it's really cool to just get autocompletion working. So I'm just going to return the homepage template here. And I need to put these users from my user service into the model, into the model of the page. So again, last but not least, let me show you just to please the crowd with the direct field injection. I'm just going to go, well, field injection. Here's my user service. And then maybe I just changed. Let me finish that off. Maybe I just changed my mind into the field injection. I want to go constructor injection. So we're going to go with that. And then, yes, you add the variable called users, which is essentially user service get users, right? That's all you need to do to hook up your Thymeleaf template with your web controller. Now, back in the template. Interestingly enough, you could have already, you will know by now, is that you get autocompletion, basic autocompletion features. You can see already, well, there's users in my model. You have a couple of helper functions, Thymeleaf specific helper functions, but in my model, there's users, list users, right? A list of users. And get auto-completion when you miss a letter here, you get error highlighting again. IntelliJ tells you you don't have such a variable defined, right? Users. Call the view. I'm going to iterate through that. Another tag. I'm just going to print out the name of every user. And again, I'm just going to go u dot. IntelliJ tells me, hey, you have a name field. You could also call the getter, right? Like so. Again, error highlighting. If you're missing a letter and whatnot, you can navigate back and forth between the model and the template file, right? So keep in mind navigation, two-way navigation, auto-completion, error highlighting. It's always the same story when it comes to those features. And one feature that I like a lot actually is what scares people, especially coming from legacy projects. And that's something that Yuri also quickly touched upon when he refactored the property name, actually with Shift F6. And then it changed the property key across all these, across all the classes. If, for example, you wanted to rename users to users for whatever reason, in the template file, hit Shift F6 or the corresponding Mac shortcut, do a refactoring really, and you'll find the name changed here. Navigating back to my Java class, you can see even the add attribute call changed here. So now I'm having a Z in here as well. So all of that works with the takeaway being trust your IDE. So all these refactorings in IntelliJ Analyze are really powerful. Renamings are really powerful. They work with template languages. They work with JavaScript files, which I'm not showing here. But it's so much more than just doing everything, doing everything manually, really. This is roughly what I wanted to show you regarding the time leaf support. This also works with, I mentioned, with velocity, with FreeMarker, all these. You can even write JSPs if you want. The support is there. Make use of it, make use of navigation. And so you don't have to, actually, there's one thing I'm missing. I wanted to do one last thing. I wanted to show you in a browser if my page actually is doing something useful. As I see here, I'm missing something, right? So this should hopefully work. Right, let's open up a browser window. I need to pull that over. Localhost 8080. I can see my two users, even with the weird spelling, because I booted up Spring with my staging profile. I'm sorry about that. So that everything worked without me having to first run the application and seeing that my template was basically correct. All right, that was the templating support, HTML support, gutter icons, navigation. Keep that in mind. Now let's have a look at something else. I promised you to talk a bit about Spring Data Jdbc, and let's see if I can still squeeze in a couple of things. First, going to show you something else. When in IntelliJ, you have these tool windows at the bottom. If you look at the tool windows for Spring, for example, you obviously, when you run your application, then you have the console window nicely highlighted with the banner here. And stuff that you can hide, which I showed you earlier. And you also have an Endpoints tab. And if you have Spring's Actuator dependency added to the project, which you did at the very beginning, then the Actuator data, for example, your health endpoints, and there's a couple of default ones. So for the database, for example, you do queries for the disk space and whatnot. You will see these health endpoints directly under the Run tool window, basically. You also get the mappings. That's the REST mappings kind of duplicated to what the endpoint window gives you. Here you can see you have a user's endpoint. That's essentially just if you exclude the library endpoints that the actuator gives you with that icon here, you can see there's actually only just one user endpoint, which corresponds to usercontroller.users, right? Runtime information, basically. And you can also have a look at the beans and you see in the Spring Boot project, there's a ton of beans. Highlighted in yellow are the ones that come from Spring Boot's auto configuration, or the ones that you basically defined yourself in white with a white background, right? So that is something that you can have a look at if you want to get into the Actuator and have pretty solid output, just have a look at the run window, which you probably, if you've been using IntelliJ with Spring, you probably already know of. Then there's another tool window, which we haven't mentioned at all yet, even though it's a Spring and Spring Boot talk. It is the Spring tool window. So I'm just going to open up the Spring tool window. And again, I get somewhat duplicated information, but I have a couple of tabs, beans again, where I can step through my application and again see, well, in your application, you are referencing an application context XML. Again, I see by default, I see all these classes that come from Spring Boot automatically. I can have a look at my application class, and you can scan through it. There's a ton of information, basically, that you can see. But this is the diagram I wanted to show you at the very beginning. These are the diagrams for now I like to sometimes have a look at, where you can see the application as a user controller, user service, web controller, and whatnot. Essentially, Spring Tool Window, Beans tab, you can step and have a look at all the beans in your Spring application. When you look at the MVC tab shows you your controllers, all the controllers you have defined, so your user controller. It shows you the endpoints that these controllers define, admins/users, for example. Also, you can see the web controller. So if you're just having a look at, hey, what controllers does my Spring application have? What URLs are defined? You can have a look at the Spring tool window and the MVC tab. There's also a data tab, and I think I have the time to pull it off. I'm just going to quickly show you. So in Spring Data, for example, you would write a user repository, which extends from a CRUD repository, for example, a Spring Data specific class. And with Spring Data Jdbc, you would actually write methods like, imagine you have a custom select method, something like that. And you're going to write add query, select star from users, something. It doesn't really matter now. Yeah, so the query itself doesn't matter now. Then you can see in the tool window, immediately IntelliJ was smart enough to pick up, hey, you have one user repository defined in your project. It has one method, a custom select method, and that custom select method, which is not inherited. These are only the not inherited methods. Actually, let me show you all the other methods that are being inherited. So you have delete bys, find alls, and whatnot, and you can see the actual query. So again, everything you see in this tool window, Spring beans, MVC specific beans, Spring Data specific beans, and that even didn't touch, that was just Spring Data Jdbc. If you're working with Spring Data JPA, IntelliJ obviously also has great JPA, Hibernate support. You can run, your queries, your JPA queries from inside IntelliJ, see if they work, see that they compile correctly or compile. You have your database tool window. There's so many different technologies that integrate with Spring, and you'll find that IntelliJ basically has superb integration with all of these tools, frameworks, libraries, adjacent technologies, and whatnot. So you'll have to play around with that for a bit. This brings me, there's unfortunately a lot more that I could show you, but this kind of brings an end to all the features that I've been rushing through now. And I'm just going to try and sum up everything I just showed you with another slide, another photograph at the end that I did, or that I prepared for this talk. So in general, if you thought, well, Marco has been speeding through all these features, I forgot everything, then fear not. What I want you to do is just keep 3 things in mind. First of all, gutter icons. Respect the gutter icons, use the gutter icons. They usually help you with navigation, but also a ton of other features. So make sure that when you navigate between files and in Spring files, use the navigation features. They always work both ways. Beans, dependencies, application contexts, and whatnot. Don't just click around in your file tree and search the right place. Completion, be it the properties completions, be it the these auto-wired, from auto-wire to constructor injection, alt-enter and all that kind of stuff, completions in the HTTP client for URLs and searching, for finding the right get method and post method and whatnot. IntelliJ supports a lot of completion in your Spring projects. Third, very important, error highlighting. Do not ignore the error highlighting. Missing beans, wrong URLs, wrong property keys, wrong types and whatnot. There's a ton of error highlighting that IntelliJ can actually already tell you about without you having to boot up the application, find out about the application failure at runtime. And just so we're going to put up the timestamps in the YouTube video for all of these features with the recording. But just a quick summary of what we went through. When you create a new project with IntelliJ, use the integrated Spring Initializer integration. So just create a new Spring project out of IntelliJ. Always remember there's Maven and Gradle support. So you can actually navigate. It's not just an XML file. You can insert stuff into the XML file, navigate between parent files and whatnot. Always find out where does a dependency come from. Gutter icons with bean context navigation. We had that. So you'll find, these gutter icons on the beans, Java classes, XML beans, doesn't really matter. You can navigate through your complete application context. We had a look at different profiles that IntelliJ was smart enough to even do an auto-completion of the profiles it detected in the run window. We had the properties file support where you have these property keys and can just go, inside where's the property being used, what type has the property. We had a look at REST controllers, HTTP clients, endpoints and whatnot. So really strong, super strong support with the HTTP client to call your Spring Boot REST controllers, or your Spring MVC REST controllers, rather. We had a look at the HTML template support with the example of ThymeLeaf. Same works for free market velocity, everything else. And we had a look at these tool windows at the end, just briefly. The Spring tool window, the Actuator tool window, where you get the information from the Actuator displayed nicely. And in the end, that means you never have to leave your IDE again, and you're just locked into IntelliJ and can do everything you ever wanted to do regarding a Spring project from inside IntelliJ. This is my last slide. Thank you. I hope you learned a thing or two for watching, and let's see if there's any questions left.
That was amazing. Thank you so much. I really like the way that you summarized it into navigation, completion, and error highlighting. I never really thought about it that way, but I knew it, but I didn't think about it that way. So that was really, really helpful. I also really love the features that you've covered, because often when people are talking to me about Spring, they're also talking about the features inside the IDE, and kind of showing them all tied together is what's really compelling. You did a great job of that. So that's a short summary to say, when we cover the Spring features, because the Java advocates are thinking about covering Spring features in Q2, we might be needing your guidance with some of these things.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah. And I also, what you mentioned is, I prepared the talk, and I also didn't think of it being navigation, completion, error highlighting, and then I just went through all the features and I thought, hey, this is essentially what it all boils down to. And you don't even have to remember every single feature. You just have to keep that in mind. And the next time you're working on something Spring related, you're thinking, hey, shouldn't there be a better way instead of just clicking around? And I just found that might help people.
It was super, super helpful. Right, we don't have any time for questions because we have to kick you off so we can do the wrap up. But thank you, it was super helpful. I'm sure people can get you on Twitter if they want to ask you some more questions.
Absolutely, ask questions. I'm always available. Twitter, YouTube chat. Ask questions. And sorry for the overtime.
Oh no, it's absolutely fine. You hit the time perfectly. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tricia. Take care. Bye, folks.